Hello, students. This is Professor Karasi with Chapter 4 for Cognitive Psych, and I'm going to pull that up now. Okay. So we talked about the scientific process last time. Okay, here it is, Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is on memory. This is an interesting chapter, but it can be considered a little involved because I'm sure it talks about the anatomy and of the brain relative to um, memory, etc. But there are some key areas of the brain I want you to be familiar with as it relates to memory. And those are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cerebellum. Those are three major players when it comes to memory. The hippocampus, very specifically, houses memory function. The amygdala is on there because the amygdala is most closely related with emotion and feeling. So usually with memories, there are emotions. And so the amygdala is absolutely affected. Okay, so let's see what we got. Okay, the hippocampus. While psychologists and neurosciences scientists debate the exact role of the hippocampus, they generally agree that it plays an essential role in both the formation of new memories about experienced events and declarative memory, which handles facts and knowledge rather than motor skills. The motor skills would be more of the cerebellum's job. The hippocampus is critical to the formation of memories of events and facts. Um, So, like I said, hippocampus, super important memory. The amygdala is involved in memory consolidation, specifically in how consolidation is modulated. Modulation refers to the strength with which a memory is consolidated. In particular, it appears that emotional arousal following an event influences the strength of the subsequent memory. Greater emotional arousal following learning enhances a person's retention of that stimulus, which is absolutely true. And that's why the amygdala is so important, because if we have a memory that is laden with emotion, then we are more likely to remember that at a later time than if it didn't have an emotional outgrowth. The cerebellum plays a role in the learning of procedural memory, like routine and practice skills, and motor learning, such as skills requiring coordination and fine motor. Playing a musical instrument, driving a car, and riding a bike are examples of skills requiring procedural memory. And those are the types of memory items that would reside within the cerebellum. Okay, so here's a nice little graph here or a little diagram of the brain areas associated with memory, which is kind of nice. Um, Frontal lobe is huge in memory, as is the parietal lobe, and even the occipital lobe because the cerebellum is back there. You don't need to know all of the names of these things. Basically, those three lobes are super important in memory. Yep, I wish it went a little slower. Okay, this is all very important. Okay, so now let's talk about types of memory. And there are various types of memory. Sensory memory is the temporal and occipital lobes are associated with sensation and are thus involved in sensory memory. Sensory memory is the briefest form of memory with no storage capability. Instead, it is a temporary holding cell for sensory info. So sensory memory is pretty fleeting. It comes in and it goes out. Short-term memory is kind of like the next stage of memory, supported by a brief pattern of neural communication that are dependent on regions of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe. The hippocampus is essential for the consolidation of info from short-term to long-term memory, which is super important. And long-term memory is maintained by a stable and permanent change in neural connections spread throughout the brain. The processes of consolidating and storing long-term memories have been particularly associated with the prefrontal cortex, cerebellum, frontal lobe, and medial temporal lobe. And again, as I'm bantering on, I'm noticing, or I've remembered, that I'm not sharing my screen. I always forget to do that. So let me first stop and do that. Hmm, where's my, okay. Share screen. Okay, so now you can see where I'm at in your textbook. Okay. So basically, the difference between short-term and long-term memory in everyday English is that short-term memory is about what's happening in the most recent. Long-term is what happened years ago. There's more time in between you and the memory for long-term. And some people are better at short-term memory than long-term memory, or vice versa, dependent on their memory style, their environment, their biology, etc. Um, but both are equally important. If you have an event that is sitting in the short-term memory that is fairly memorable or evokes emotion, it is very likely that it's then going to consolidate and move on to the long-term memory, which is what usually happens. Now, when things are happening around us that we aren't necessarily paying a great deal of attention to, that really don't have to do with us in the moment, those things will flee. Those things will not consolidate into long-term memory. Three stages of learning as a memory process: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is defined as the initial learning of info. Storage refers to maintaining that info over time. And retrieval is the ability to access info when you need it. So we go through this process multiple times a day. We make sense of it, process it in encoding. It then goes to our storage area, and if it's important, it'll stay there. If it's not important, it'll go. And then retrieval for another time. So if we have an experience that is like what we just dealt with, it's likely that we'll be able to draw on a past experience to glean more insight. And while we're going through this, I like you to think about your own memories and kind of think about your memory performance. Are you good at remembering things? What kind of things are you good at remembering? Are you good at memorizing? Are you good at remembering things that are important to you or evoke emotion? Are you better with long-term memory, remembering things that may have happened a long time ago versus just yesterday, or vice versa? All of those things are very insightful for us to think about relative to our own memory and those around us. Okay, let's see here. So encoding, I just want you to basically know encoding as processing information. Okay. Flashbulb memory. I do want you to know what a flashbulb memory is. Um, Originally coined by Brown and Kulik to describe this sort of vivid memory of finding out an important piece of news. The name refers to how some memories seem to be captured in the mind like a flash photograph. Because of the distinctiveness, meaning it kind of sets it apart from other memories, and emotionality of the news, they seem to become permanently etched in the mind with exceptional clarity. So something like 9/11, that usually is described as a flashbulb memory, or the Boston Massacre, or actually not the Boston Massacre, the Boston Marathon, excuse me, but it was a massacre. Those types of things where people are being hurt while there are injuries, where it comes out of nowhere and no one's expecting. Um, the event to occur, those are consistent with flashbulb memories. An accident would be considered a flashbulb memory. Usually, people's recall of flashbulb memories are very high. They can remember details regarding the event. And that's usually attributed to the fact that a flashbulb memory is intended to evoke a great deal of emotion. And again, the more emotional arousal we have in an experience, the more likely we are to remember it at a later time, positive, negative, or indifferent. Okay. So you can read all of these types of examples and things like that. Storage, again, memory storage allows us to hold on to information for a long duration of time, oftentimes even a lifespan. Memories are not stored as exact replicas of experiences. Instead, they are modified and reconstructed during retrieval and recall. And I have an example. So I want you to think about a time where, let's say, you and a family member, like a sibling, are discussing a memory, and their depiction and their description of the memory is a little bit different than yours. That's completely normal. However, it was simply because when encoded, um, well, a couple of things could happen. You're processing information differently. Okay, so oftentimes when my sister says something, do you remember when this happened? Yes, but I don't exactly remember it the same way you're describing, because we process it differently in our memory storage, and they're not exact replicas. They're kind of consolidated pieces of the gist of a memory as opposed to a replica. But I'm sure you've experienced that. I mean, when you think about it, think about eyewitness testimony, right? So, and that's something that's pretty short term. So, what was I going to say? Oh, eyewitness testimony. So, for eyewitness testimony, if two people are brought in who witnessed an accident, and you ask them, "Can you tell me the color of the car and the license plate, etc.?" You wouldn't believe how much detail or how different their explanations might be. One might say a blue car, one might say a red car, and you're thinking, how could that be? If they both saw the same thing, how is it that one thinks they saw this and one thinks they saw that? But it happens all of the time, and our brains act differently. So short-term versus long-term memory storage, again, day-to-day things, which are actually stored in our working memory, which I believe is the next chapter. But short-term memory might include, perfunctory type of duties like the procedural stuff housed in the cerebellum, or it might just include, what do I need to do for this week? Long term is again looking at a longer period of time, kind of like comparing short-term goals to long-term goals. You can read about engrams and traces, retrieval, process of remembering info stored in the long-term memory, which is the recall. One thing I want you to think about, I'm sure it's coming up, but I want you to think about how you remember things. What are techniques that you employ to remember things? So one thing we talked, I don't know if I talked about, yeah, I did last lecture. I talked about mnemonic devices, like please excuse my dear Aunt Sally as order of operations. Think about ways in which you've helped yourself remember. Sometimes people use post-it notes. Many people nowadays will use their phones. They'll put things in their phones, set reminders, alarms, put things in their calendars, etc. Um, People's performance on memory tasks can all be altogether different. as well, depending on learning style, I think, as well as memory technique. Okay, so serial recall. People tend to recall items or events in the order in which they occurred. This is called serial recall and can be used to help cue memories. By thinking about a string of events or even words, it is possible to use a previous memory to cue the next item in the series. Serial recall helps a person to remember the order of events in his or her life. These memories appear to exist on a continuum on which more recent events are absolutely more easily recalled. Free recall occurs when a person must recall many items but can recall them in any order. It is another commonly studied paradigm in memory research. Like serial recall, free recall is subject to the primacy and recency effects. And I am going to explain to you what the primary and recency effects are. So they're actually very interesting. Primary effect is if a person is more likely to remember what was said to them in the beginning of a segment than most recent. So, for instance, I don't know if you've ever taken an IQ test, but I've taken several IQ tests over time. And one of the tasks is that the diagnostician will say a series of numbers, and then they'll ask you to repeat them. Now, if you're better at the primacy effect, you're going to remember the numbers that the diagnostician first said to you as opposed to lastly said to you. Okay. Recency effect is the opposite. This is when a person will remember the numbers that have come most recent in a series. So in my example of the psychologist indicating the numbers and asking you to reiterate them, person who is better with recency will remember the ones that were last stated as opposed to the ones that were firstly stated. Okay. And each of us have a different style of memory. Most people report having better luck with recency effect, where they're able to process and remember information that is told to them um, most recently, as opposed to at the beginning of a segment. But people have the ability to do both. Cued recall or cues can facilitate recovery of memories that have been lost. So, like little reminders. In research, a process called cued recall is used to study these effects. Cued recall occurs when a person is given a list to remember and is then given cues during the testing phase to aid in the retrieval of memories. And we do this all of the time, especially with children when they're first learning something new and they don't necessarily get it the first time. Frequently the teacher or the parent will say something to ignite that memory. And again, we do that with seniors, we do that with adults, etc. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the tip of the tongue phenomena, where you're thinking of something, you know exactly what you're talking about, but for whatever reason, you just can't get it out. A retrieval or a cued recall could help the tip of the tongue phenomena. Interference with memory retrieval. Interference occurs in memory when there is an interaction between the new material being learned and previous learned material. There are two main kinds of interference, proactive and retroactive. So this is when something gets in the way of creating and holding on to the memory. Proactive interference is the forgetting of information due to interference from previous knowledge. Past memories can inhibit the encoding of new memories. Absolutely. This is particularly true if they are learned in similar contexts and the new information is similar to the previous. This is what is happening when you have trouble remembering your new phone number because your old phone is stuck in your head. Good example. Retroactive interference occurs when newly learned information interferes with the encoding or recall of previously learned info. If a participant was asked to recall a list of words and was then immediately presented with new information, it could interfere with remembering the initial list. If you learn to use a new kind of computer and then later have to use the old model again, you might find you have forgotten how to use it. This is due to retroactive interference. Very good examples. Retrieval failure is sometimes when a person is not able to retrieve a memory that they have previously encoded. This can be due to a decay, a natural process that occurs with when neural connections decline, like an unused muscle. And here is where they talk about the tip of the tongue phenomena. So the tip of the tongue phenomena is the failure to retrieve a word from memory combined with a partial recall and the feeling that retrieval is imminent. People who experience this can often recall one or more features of the target word, such as the first letter, words that sound similar, or words that have the same meaning. This reminds me of a time where when I was teaching in person, I would play what we call the name game, and people would experience the tip of the tongue phenomena all the time. The name game was a game that I incorporated where I'd pick a student sitting down to say their name, and then I'd ask the person sitting next to them to say their own name plus the person who came before. And essentially, there'd be somebody in the room who would try to remember, 45 names. And it was a very entertaining memory game. But oftentimes, my observations would be of the tip of the tongue phenomena, where students would say, "Oh my God, I know your name starts with an M, but I can't think of what it is." Or they would say something that sounded similar to the person's name, but not exactly. It's really fascinating. Okay, so sensory we talked about. Sensory is information we're taking in from our five senses, so vision, auditory, smell, taste, and what am I missing? Vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell. There we go. You can read about Sperling. Yeah, you can read about the study with the numbers or the ink color and the colors. That is very interesting. Oh, the Game of Simon. I don't even know if they sell that anymore. That was so big when I was a kid. It never really entertained me, but it was interesting. So it was a memory game for those of you who haven't heard of it. And Simon would start with easy patterns. So the green would light up, and then it was your job to then touch the green. You had to imitate or mimic whatever pattern Simon gave to you. So as you continued through the memory game, the patterns got harder, and you'd have to try and remember, okay, green, blue, red. It's an interesting game, especially now learning about memory. Um, and it really tested the memory of a lot of people. Okay, can read about shortcomings of magic number. Um, let's see. You can read about the chess playing and the magic numbers. Chunking, I want to talk about. Chunking is super important. So, chunking is a way in which we can help ourselves remember. Chunking is when we kind of categorize information and we digest it in chunks, so to speak. So instead of handing someone an entire book on a topic if they wanted to learn about something, you're giving them just pieces so that they can better remember. So, for instance, if someone is putting something together, and there's an instruction module, some people who are really good at that kind of thing could look at the instruction module from front to back and know what to do. Many of us, including myself, absolutely cannot do that. We have to look at step one before we go to step two and so forth. And we have to make sure that they're all right. So that's kind of what chunking is, where we take pieces out of a larger concept and focus on those pieces individually to then gradually scaffold more information. Can read about Ebbinghaus. William James's study. Again, William James we've learned about. I talked about recency and primacy effects with you. Here's an example of numerical series. If a person was to tell you this numerical series, is a person more likely to remember 9754, or are they more inclined to remember 4273? It's a long series. And that looks like that'll do it for chapter 4. Chapter 5 will be kind of an addendum to memory where we're specifically looking at a certain type of memory, which is called working memory. And I will start that shortly. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.